So welcome to this, my first online retreat. It's called the Wilderness Experience. In February, I led the Lent retreat at the retreat house in Pleshy, and it was called the Wilderness Experience. It seemed appropriate then for Lent, but I never realised how appropriate it was going to be for the times that we find ourselves in now as we struggle through the issues around coronavirus. This is part one, and there'll be 3 other parts which I'll do on different days. So here, as we begin the wilderness experience, we're going to explore the wilderness in the Bible. But let's begin with some worship, some prayers. Lord, you have always led your people and travelled with them. You called Abraham from the city to the desert. Jacob discovered your closeness in his loneliness as he fled from Esau. As Moses and the people of Israel travelled in the wilderness, you went before them always, a pillar of cloud by day, and by night a pillar of fire. But they did not always acknowledge your presence, and were sometimes afraid of it. Meet with us again in this time, Lord. Make us aware of you. Praise to you who knows our struggles. Led by the Spirit before your life's work began, you wrestled with your demons. Accompanied by wild beasts and angels, you could not be beguiled. Praise to you. God of all seasons, in your pattern of things, there is a time for keeping and a time for losing, a time for building up and a time for pulling down. In this holy season of Lent, as we journey with our Lord to the cross, help us to discern in our lives what we must lay down and what we must take up, what we must end and what we must begin. Amen. And a reading now from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verses 29 to 33. I said to you, you must not dread them or be afraid. The Lord your God who goes at your head will fight for you. He will do again what you saw him do for you in Egypt and in the wilderness. You saw there how the Lord your God carried you all the way to this place, as a father carries his son. In spite of this, you persisted in not trusting the Lord your God, who went ahead on the journey to find a place for your camp. He went in the fire by night and in a cloud by day to show you the route you should take. And now a reflection called The Desert by Kathy Galloway. You wander the desert for a long time, a testing time, often looking back towards captivity with some regret. At least there you knew where you were. Here you know nothing. But slowly, imperceptibly, you stop wandering the desert. You live the desert. In solitude and quiet, you see new things. The nature of the landscape. That there are no high rises blocking out the air, no structures, strictures, tramlines, guidelines, and therefore many options. With few possessions, you learn to travel light. The miracle of survival and the grace of faith, deepen tenacity, strengthen determination, and peace, not as the world gives it, comes in, going on. A new sense of identity is founded on the rock beneath the sand, and with no family but the family of the nomads who, crossing your path more often than you first realised, now that you've got your night sight, accompany you for a longer 40 years or thereabouts, or shorter time. Living the desert, it dawns on you that there are no hard edges, borders, barriers, only wide horizons. Everything is immanence, everywhere and nowhere is centre. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. A moment or two to pause. O Divine One, whose sole purpose is love, tune our attention to a simple mindfulness and let the distractions fall away, that we might walk this day with thankfulness for every step. Be with each of us when we become overwhelmed. Give us faith that the unfolding of your love is the goal of our journey. Amen. So, the wilderness experience. Well, when I started thinking about this retreat and planning it felt to me a little bit as if I was in a wilderness. I was surrounded and almost suffocated by so many ideas and thoughts about wilderness. And then when I looked up keywords in the Bible, Googled keywords in the Bible for wilderness, it came up so many to hundreds of references, both in the Old and the New Testament, to the wilderness. So this wilderness is very much part of our Christian experience. When I met with the group on the retreat for the first time and introduced the weekend, I got them to brainstorm words that occurred to them when they thought of the word wilderness. And these are some of the things they came up with. Uncultivation, desert, arid, lost, disorientated, no comforts, frightened, barren, beauty, lonely, waste, big open space, temptation, uncomfortable, invigorating, testing, scary, time of growth, natural. So many different words that word, one word wilderness, conjures up. And some surprising words in there as well. But you know, there are many wildernesses in our lives. There are the spiritual wildernesses, physical wildernesses, times when nothing seems right, when everything seems strange. So there are the wildernesses we can walk through, and the wildernesses that we end up living through. So what might be the definition of a wilderness? Maybe it's a place where nothing is as it was, where all barriers and familiar landmarks have been removed, where there seems no direction. We don't know which is north or south or east or west. And I thought of some wildernesses that I've experienced. When we were in the Holy Land, I remember being very surprised that the wilderness wasn't just a barren desert, but there were hills and scrub and one place a monastery. And then last year in Cornwall, we visited a place called Kennel Vale, which is an old gunpowder factory, now in ruins, and now a wilderness, because nature has taken over, and it is the most beautiful place. Remnants of man's action, but then nature taking control. And then some years ago, on Good Friday, I was on a train in Australia travelling across the Nullarbor Desert, and it seemed a very interesting place to be on Good Friday, and these are some of the reflections I had at the time, albeit sitting from a very comfortable train. But it occurred to me, despite the arid dryness, there are green shrubs everywhere, and we know that when it does rain, then flowers bloom almost instantly. They lie dormant until touched by rain, and then flourish. Our souls too lie dormant until touched by God's Spirit. We need the continual refreshment in order not to become like the desert. When Jesus hung on the cross, and at the instant he gave up his life, then the world was held in that moment of eternity, a moment when everything became desert, removed from God's life-giving water. But from that moment on, we can know that the source is always there, and that we never have to be afraid of the desert. We are able to reach down and drink from that well of living water which Jesus promised. When he spoke to that Samaritan woman at the well, he said, "Whoever asks will receive a drink." So as we continue on this journey into the wilderness, may the one who dwells in every landscape divest you of all that hinders your path to God. So let's have a look at the wilderness in the Bible. And as I said before, there are plenty of references to the wilderness. It begins right at the beginning with Adam and Eve being sent out from the beautiful Garden of Eden to live in the wilderness. And Abraham too was sent from his comfortable life to wander. And then of course there is Moses and the people of Israel, escaping slavery in Egypt, travelling through the Red Sea into the wilderness for 40 years. And before that, Moses had worked in the desert. He tended the sheep of his father-in-law, and it was in the wilderness that God spoke to Moses through the burning bush. As Moses tended the sheep in the wilderness, he saw a flaming bush and was curious and approached. And his curiosity and his ability at his time in the wilderness allowed God to speak to him. And in their 40 years in the wilderness, Israel learnt much about how to be community, how to live together, and above all, they came to know God. Then there's the prophet Elijah, who after defeating that massive act of defeating the prophets of Baal, fled into the wilderness and met with God, not in the earthquake, wind or fire, but in that still small space in the wilderness. But there are women too who experience the wilderness. We have Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, driven into the wilderness twice, first when she was pregnant and then with her son, both times driven there by Sarah and Abraham. And yet in that wilderness, Hagar finds well springs and experiences God's presence so clearly that at one point she dares even to name God. "You are El Roy," she says. Or have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? And there's a lovely verse from a Song of Songs, chapter 8. Coming from the wilderness with my beloved on my arm. And so what about the New Testament? We have John the Baptist, who we know lived in the wilderness for many years with his hareskin coat and eating locusts. Spent those years growing up in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. And St. Paul, after his Damascus Road experience, after his sight was restored to him, went off and spent 3 years in Arabia, in the desert, coming to terms with his ministry, preparing himself before coming back. But one of the most beautiful images of a woman finding provision in the wilderness comes from the book of Revelations, from St. John, writing in chapter 12, relates his vision of a celestial woman who wears sand for clothing, stars for the crown, and the moon for her shoes, crying out in the labour of delivering a child. Verse 14. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Just a few of the wilderness references. So what did they all get from their wilderness experience? Space to recover, space to prepare, space to listen to God away from distractions. But I guess it wasn't total isolation, and John the Baptist lived in the wilderness for years. Therefore there must have been sustenance and something to keep him going. And we know Jesus went for 40 days, for a long time in the wilderness. But I don't believe he went all that time without something, without water. We know he fasted and prayed. And we know at the end it says, angels tended him, and there were wild animals. So a desert doesn't offer a place of escape from who we are. Rather, it provides a landscape where what we are, who we are, and what we mean by success becomes more apparent, more visible. The desert doesn't allow for leaving ourselves behind. So what are these wildernesses? Sometimes the wilderness is a place where our wells have run dry, where a spiritual practice that we've had or prayers that we've had don't seem to work anymore. Sometimes things that we do have become dull and difficult. We have to ask ourselves whether we're to sit with the pain or go deeper, or is God leading us in a new direction? These are the questions of the wilderness. When the world goes dry, listen. Sit by it with your ear pressed to its rim. Hear the empty and the hollow of it. Let be, let be. When finally you hear your breath echo back to you, let this sound be your first prayer. Where there is breath, there is water somewhere. Breathe. So could the wilderness be a place of freedom? Maybe. Because there are no rules. Everything exists as it is, and we have to struggle, but we can go where we like, we can forage and explore, learn about ourselves, learn what to shed. It's a place where we are lost. There are no markers, only those we make ourselves. Yet there are places of shelter. We find the strength to overcome fears, to surmount physical difficulties. to manage the hardships, cry out for protection. Do you know there is no wilderness where God is not? In the wilderness, we're open to the elements, and above all, we're open to God. Time to pause, time to take stock, to look for a guide, to look for signs of life. Martin Luther said, "God made the world out of nothing, and only when we become nothing can God make anything of us." And now something I found in a book by Francis J. Roberts. "If I choose to hide you away, it is for a reason. I have brought you to this place. Drink in the silence, seek solitude, listen to the silence. It will teach you. It will build strength. Let others share it with you. It is little to be found elsewhere. Silence will speak more to you in a day than the world of voices can teach you in a lifetime. Find silence, find solitude, and having discovered her riches, bind her to your heart." Question for you. When all else is stripped away, who am I in God? And now a couple of things that you might like to try in the wilderness. One is called what I call deep listening. And what I suggest is that you go outside if you can and stand somewhere and shut your eyes and just stand for 10 minutes listening. And you'll be surprised what you can hear. And then when you've done that, if you wish, you could come and take a piece of paper and some crayons, some pencils, and just draw the sounds that you've heard. Some will be soft and some will be sharp, and draw a picture, a pattern, a shape of the sounds. And then the other, that was hearing, and now sight, something we might call lectio visio. Just deepening our awareness of what we see. And I invite you to find an object indoors or a flower, something outside, and get close to it and just look at it and allow it to speak to you. And one way to do this is either to make a telescope with your hand, hold it to your eye and just focus on that object. And stay with it and see what it has to say to you. And I like to finish this retreat with a lovely video, and I will put the link on the site. It's called "Follow the Heron" by a folk singer called Karine Polart. And that's what we're doing. As we follow Jesus, we follow in the footsteps of the heron. So thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed sharing together, and certainly I have enjoyed sharing my thoughts on the wilderness. And next time we meet, we'll look at Christ in the wilderness.